Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. I'm Dan Liebenson. I'm here with B'nai Levi. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how are you?
I'm good. I'm, making it through. It's adventurous times that we're living through. But I guess when we were here together last week, it was just the day after the coup attempt, and now it's a week later. It's the day after the impeachment. Um, and obviously it's like very different, but I do keep thinking about that, very early text that we studied about Rabban Gamliel being impeached, so it's like we were talking earlier before the show that there's a lot of ways in which it's the opposite story actually, and the kind of uprising is by the good people, but still, I keep my mind keeps going back there.
Yeah. Even in their oppositeness, some of the anti-parallels are illuminating. Maybe we should go back to that. I don't know. But you had a really interesting point. I think you should share it.
Well, it wasn't my point, but somebody had asked me about it and said, wasn't there something in the Talmud somewhere where and I think it's the Maturgaman, which is like but I don't know if first of all, I'm not sure what it says in the text, that there were two categories of people in that era. There was
Yeah.
the Maturgaman, who was kind of a translator who would who would like translate things that people didn't understand. But then there was something like an amplifier, and that was just because they didn't have microphones. And so there would be somebody at the front of the room lecturing, and then there would be someone in the middle of the room kind of repeating what he was saying, and so that the people in the back could hear it. And I think, like, as my recollection of the text, and we're neither of us, I don't think, is looking at it right now, that that was the idea, and that person kind of at a certain point. So what's happening is that Rabban Gamliel is haranguing Rabbi Joshua, over some matter, and he's just being mean and more mean, and eventually the person who's like the repeater just kind of like stops talking. He's just like, I'm just not going to participate in this anymore, and yeah, I mean, it just sort of feels a little bit like what Twitter did.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I think what we decide to amplify and um, yeah, and whose voices are being heard and what we can do to um, if not silence, prevent the amplification of other voices is just really interesting.
I think that maybe that has a little bit to do with what we're doing today and what we've been talking about for the last many weeks, which are these times when the rabbis in the Talmud are kind of deciding that it's time to overturn various Torah rules over some principle. And in contrast to, we've talked about the people who today will say, my hands are tied. I mean, I would love to, allow the ordination of LGBT people. I would love to let women out of bad marriages, or when they're in aguna, it's stuck in a marriage. But what can I do? My hands are tied. And we're looking at the text here saying, no, your hands aren't tied. Like, you actually have options. And yet there's also this other argument that says, but there's some value to imagining that our hands are tied, because otherwise there's no law. Otherwise we're just changing things all the time. There's no stability. There's no sense that there really is governance by something other than people's whims. And I think that question about Twitter and whether Twitter should be deplatforming people, even if we profoundly disagree with what they're saying, or and I mean, I think Twitter, in the cases that they're doing it now, it has to do with danger to life and things like that, which obviously I'm in favor of. But but I still recognize the counter argument that it's, where does it stop, where it's dangerous, and so in a case like that, where we see one guy, here's Rabban Gamliel, he's the head guy, and then here's this amplifying guy, and he's like, I'm not doing this anymore.
Mhm.
Is that okay? Is that, even though we think Rabban Gamliel was being overly mean to Rabbi Joshua, or is it really right to happen what happens next, which is that they do it through a more of a process and say, well, we're going to remove him from his position.
And maybe it speaks to the fact that both are right. That
Mhm.
one is an individual response and the other is a systemic response.
Mhm.
And maybe it's, suggesting that both are necessary or both are legitimate or possible.
And actually, that's what happened in this most recent political, story with Trump, was that first the private actors acted, and many have said way too late. But first, Facebook suspended him, and then all the other companies uh, started to suspend his accounts and everything. And then the next phase we haven't really talked about, but now there's all this stuff where all these private companies are saying that they're not going to donate political donations to people that voted to not accept the electoral college results. And so there's this the wave of private actors acting. And then the question is does that embolden the political actors? Does that not embolden them, but it kind of makes them feel like maybe we can do this or we should do it? Because I mean, if these private people are doing it, then we're supposed to be represented, right? So there is that relationship between the person who just decides I'm not doing this anymore and the process getting going.
For sure. I think McConnell's response to corporate funding of the Republican Party being pulled and saying, uh-oh, this is going to be bad for us, and how that seems to have influenced his willingness to speak out, I think shows the interrelatedness of the individual response and the governmental or,
Mm-hmm.
systemic response.
Well, so in the text that we're doing here about the Ben Soeru Moreh,
Wait, I'm sorry to
oh,
interrupt you. One more
yeah.
thought. And I think it gets to that issue we talked about earlier and on a number of occasions, which is the power of minhag to push svara. In other words, the power of the kind of non-legislative popular behaviors to push those who have the power in the system to make systemic change. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of about the arrow, like where's the arrow? We I think we've been conditioned to think, even in a democracy, we've been conditioned to think about the arrow of causation being that the government
Mm-hmm.
debates and decides, and yes, they're representative of the people, so there's some way in which they're in touch with the will of the people, but really it's only in the rarest of cases that maybe there'll be a popular protest or something that really changes minds, or a very long popular protest like the civil rights movement, where eventually, the elected representatives come around, but that somehow, the causation is coming from the decision makers, as opposed to this idea that is much more clearly stated, I guess, or clearly sort of understood in Jewish law, in the Talmud, but that we see also here if we're looking at it, which is that no, it's actually kind of the law often follows what the people are doing, not necessarily what they're protesting to do, but what they're actually doing. What the sort of sense and expectation is. I mean, it's interesting. Even granted, I mean, this is true only in a certain world in which I live, and there was another world which I think saw it very differently. But when Trump's Twitter account was suspended, there was just incredible relief. There were a lot of people say it wasn't even like a political, like, oh, I'm so, glad because I hate him politically. It was just like, oh my gosh, it's so quiet. It's like nice and quiet, right? Like, and there was just some sense that I even think that relief being greater than a kind of I told you so, this is, but just that sense of kind of quiet may have actually been a larger factor than we understand yet in emboldening the other corporate actors to say, we should do this too, because it's not that we're not actually entering into a political partisan. It's actually just that we were actually in some ways causing suffering. People were suffering because of having to,
Yeah.
contend with this all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, so now look at our text that we've been doing, the Ben Soeru Moreh, which, how did you, in the first, it's like a wayward and rebellious, and were you saying? What's your favorite translation of that?
I think my favorite translation is wayward and rebellious, but I have so many inputs in my ear of stubborn and rebellious.
Mm-hmm.
That's the common traditional translation that I sometimes inadvertently default to translating it as stubborn and rebellious. But I think wayward. I think sorare is more like wayward, gone off the path.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think stubborn is so much it. I think it is wayward and rebellious.
Okay, so there's wayward and rebellious son, and the basic idea, not to repeat too much of what we've already done, but the basic idea that we covered, 2 weeks ago is that the fundamental idea, which, by the way, like for those who haven't tuned into the last couple of weeks, the Torah says if you have a, quote, wayward and rebellious son, and the parents kind of can't deal with them, and they bring him to the town elders and they say this is a wayward and rebellious son, and the town elders agree, then that person should be stoned and killed. And initially we looked at, well, what age does that person have to be? And the answer became that the rabbis were narrowing it to a very, very small band of age, early, just the earlier, from the early stages of puberty to the late stages of puberty, and older than that, he's not really a son anymore, and younger than that, he's not a man yet, or whatever, not responsible. Anyway, long story short, the real idea here is that you would be stoning and killing this person not because of a crime that he committed, not as a punishment, but as a deterrent. Or not a deterrent. What's the other word that says that just to take him, just to take him out of society, so that it's really to prevent future crimes. It's seeing somebody who has the potential for criminality or bad behavior and saying he has the potential to be so bad that he needs to be killed before he can get to that age.
And I would say it's to put in even sharper point on potential. It's someone who shows the signs that they think indicate that he will inevitably come to commit crimes for which the punishment is death. In other words, he would eventually become a murderer.
And that it's so
other
clear.
capital crimes. Right. So it's not just we're going to kill these people who we think have the potential to be this. We're only going to feel good about killing the ones who we think are inevitably going to do it, which as an approach isn't any different from what the rabbis have already done, which is to sort of kosher the killing of someone, or to permit the killing of someone who is a rodef, a pursuer, someone who is imminently and inevitably out to kill someone. So that's already okay. No one at this point in Jewish history is questioning the legitimacy of killing, if you can't injure and disable and prevent, the killing of someone who is running after someone else with a sword to kill him. For sure, to do the same to you, that they can already do. So in a way, they're shoehorning the Ben Surah Moreh into that category, which I think they've already established as something they can stomach.
So, but they most likely, for the same reasons that we today would have a sense that doesn't sound right. You're killing somebody because of something that they might, do in the future.
Right, because this guy doesn't have a sword in his hand, right? This is a 13, 14-year-old kid who's not running after someone. He doesn't have a sword in his hand. And the rabbis are saying, but he will.
Well, the Torah is saying, but he will. Right. I mean, in other words, that I think that the rabbis, my sense is that the rabbis don't really like this idea. Like you say, they accept the idea of the rodef. They accept the idea that if you know that somebody's actually out to kill you, then you can kill. That the Torah says you can kill him before he kills you. And I think that the rabbis are, okay with that. Like that kind of makes sense. That if you really know somebody's out to kill you, then you don't have to wait for them to make the attempt. You can kill them first, right? But here, this idea that there's a kind of almost like a thought crime, but like a future, I think we talked about, like, it's that Tom Cruise movie where
Minority Report,
where if somehow like in that movie, that the person's going to do it. So that's more of a version like a rodef. But in this case, it's like you suspect, right? You have the sense that this is the kind of person who would do something like that. I think that the rabbis really aren't aren't thrilled about that idea, and so so they ultimately try to legislate it out of existence.
Yeah, but I don't think the Torah makes it. I don't think it's clear from the Torah that the Torah understands this kid as that. I think the rabbis have a real theological dilemma.
Uh-huh.
Their dilemma is, how can I love a God or obey a God who looks to me like a God who wants to kill this kid who is merely wayward and obedient? He's drinking, he's a glutton, he's a drunk, he's quote unquote, he's not heeding his parents' word. That's all that I think is really going on in the Torah. And they either don't want a God who does that, so they're trying to redeem God, or they don't want a tradition that does that, or both. And so I think they're redefining and retrojecting this definition back into the Torah of who this eligible for death, eligible to be stoned person is, which is so, for me, so obviously different from who the Torah is talking about, that it redeems God and it limits who this can ever be done to, who can be labeled this.
Okay, so the first thing that so you're saying that the Torah is basically looking, and this I think is the straightforward read in the Torah, that it is just a punishment. This is a bad kid, bad person. We don't need to have people like that in our community. Young people like that. So let's kill him if the parents don't want him, right?
Yeah, and we talked about this the very first week, which was, this is a giant moral step forward from what we know existed before, which was patria potestas. The father has the right to, I brought you into this world, I can take you out, to kill any child for any reason. Now it's, no, a parent doesn't have that right. That's the moral move of the Torah. And I think everybody must have been happy with that, for it to be recorded and left alone for at least somewhere around 1500 years. Now the moral dilemma is not who does the killing and who has the right to kill this kid, but really, do we want to be killing kids? Okay, maybe we're willing to kill this kind of kid. So let's say that's the kind of kid that was talking about.
Okay, so the first narrowing is to say we're only going to kill a kid if we believe that he has the potential, the likelihood, the near certainty that he's going to become a killer, someone worthy of the death penalty in the future. Then we start to narrow it even further, right? So then in the world of people who are likely to become, right now, it's only if you're a certain age when we figure this out, a very limited band of age until you figure it out. And last week we really
maybe a 6-month range, the rabbis say, super down.
Right. And then last week we started to look at, and only if when you kind of catch him, like when you decide this is the moment where I'm going to take him in, these various things have to be happening, which is that, what we talked about last week, that he has to be eating a certain amount of meat. Well, he has to be eating meat and drinking wine when you catch him and decide to take him to the elders, and it has to be a certain amount of meat and wine.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he has to be in the act of it. That's an interesting take. I actually never thought about that. But at the very least, he has to have checked off these behaviors.
I think he has to. I read it as I can't read it any way other than you catch him in the act, because everybody has eaten a certain amount of meat and wine in their life.
Well, one of the reasons I don't think it's catching him in the act is because of what the next Mishnah says. The next Mishnah actually talks about where this kid has to eat this meat and drink this wine and under what conditions. So I don't think the where ends up being in the presence of the parents, but we'll get there.
Okay. So yeah,
it's sort of like I read the end of this story.
Right. That's true. Okay. Fair enough. I that makes sense. Okay. But but in any event, but there has to be at least an episode where it's not just somebody that ate meat and drank wine, because everybody does. There's some particular episode where he's got to have eaten meat and drunk wine, and then it's like, okay, but not only eat meat and drink wine, but eat a certain amount of meat and a certain amount of wine, and the and he can't have been doing that on his way to do a mitzvah. And so like, right, and it has to actually be kosher, which is like the opposite of what you might think. Like you might think it's like, no, if he's using non-kosher meat, that shows that he's wayward and rebellious. No, but like that may be true, but we're only going to allow you to take him in to the cups, take him in if he was eating kosher meat, or right. And we talked last week a lot about, if people can go back to last week, about why maybe that is, but bottom line is that we're that our what we're seeing here is that it's just narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing these cases, and we're going to keep narrowing, but spoiler alert, it's going to get so narrow that functionally there can't ever be such a thing.
That's right. And for me, the chuckles of how they narrow get louder and louder and more obvious, and I have to ask myself, what are they really trying to say here? What's the real message? Remember, the Talmud is never about what it's about. The specifics of the content of the case at hand aren't what we're trying to learn about. We're not ultimately learning about the Ben Sura Moreh. We are not being taught to deal with stubborn and rebellious children.
Right.
So we'll leave that on the table for now.
Okay, so should we keep going in the text?
Yep.
All right. So we talked about that the food has to be particularly kosher, but it's beyond that. There's all kinds of elements of kosher. We don't just mean that it was slaughtered properly, but it's got to be like this food that a regular person's allowed to eat, not something that was supposed to be given to priests, or something that was supposed to be given to priests, or could have been given to priests. So the bottom line is the food that he's eating has to be food that he was fully allowed to eat. And, again, actually, if you were trying to eat food that you're not allowed to eat, which you would think is something really bad that you should be, in trouble for, actually, that's the time when you know for sure that he can't be turned in as a stubborn and rebellious son if he was eating non-kosher food.
Right.
So here, Steinsaltz, the translator, explains, the Mishnah summarizes: if he ate an item that involves a mitzvah, or an item that involves a transgression, or right, so it's like part of you is like, well, then what's left? Well, the answer is that what's left is neutral, right? But if he was doing something particularly good or particularly bad, it doesn't count.
Yeah, I would hear here a mitzvah is not particularly good. It's a commanded. Like, you're not commanded to eat lunch. Right? You are commanded to have a celebratory wedding meal. So that's an example of a mitzvah situation. Matzah, the matzah at the Seder. You are commanded to eat matzah at the Seder. Are you commanded to eat matzah the rest of Pesach? No, you're actually not. So that's something, if you do eat matzah on the third day of Pesach, that's neither in the category of mitzvah nor in the category of transgression. There's an example.
But and up to where we are now, if you're eating lunch, that could be, because ostensibly if you're eating lunch, it's kosher. Right. And it's not on the way to a mitzvah. So yeah, like if you're eating lunch, that's one of the cases where you could be deemed to be a stubborn, rebellious son.
Right.
Okay, so
what comes to mind? This is kind of miscellaneous, but what just came to mind in this focus on the ordinary dealings is over in the Tractate of Shabbat, Rava says, when you come before the final judge at the end of your life, this is sort of God imagined as the final judge, you're going to be asked. It's one of my favorite texts. I forget if it's 6 or 7 things. And the very first thing you're asked is, were you honest in your business dealings? It's not, were you a murderer? Did you do were you a thief? Obviously horrible things. It was, how did you behave in your everyday affairs, where it's actually the most challenging to constantly be an ethical, kind human being. So maybe that's going on here. I'm not sure.
I think I've told you, I don't know, even maybe on the show, but I once heard a comedian, a Jewish comedian, talking about them. And he said, yeah, it's very, very Jewish. The first thing after you die, they ask you, how's business?
All right.
Um, anyway, so the, so, so, um, so the summary is, if he ate an item that involves performing a mitzvah, or an item that involves a transgression, or he ate any food in the world that wasn't meat, or drank any beverage in the world but that wasn't wine, he does not become a stubborn and rebellious son, meaning he can't be caught or he can't be declared to be a stubborn and rebellious son unless he particularly ate a meal at a neutral time that was meat and wine.
Right.
Unless he actually eats meat and drinks wine, as it is stated, and here they're quoting Deuteronomy, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He does not listen to our voice. He is a glutton, zolel, and a drunkard, vesove. And the Mishnah goes on to say, one is not called a glutton and a drunkard unless he eats meat and drinks wine. And although there's no explicit proof, right, that the Torah in Deuteronomy doesn't say meat and wine, there's an allusion to that matter in another verse from Proverbs that says, "Be not among the wine drinkers," and says, "Besove yain," the drinkers of wine, using that word, and the gluttonous eaters, bezolale basar, is what it says in Proverbs, the gluttons of meat. And so, because in Proverbs it says the drinkers of wine and the gluttons of meat, we can read that back to the Torah where it just says he's a glutton and a drunkard, that must mean he's eating meat and wine. That's the logic here.
Right. So I want to sit here for a minute because, first of all, we should notice that it's uncharacteristic of a Mishnah to cite Torah as a proof text. The Mishnah is famously what's called unjustified. In other words, it doesn't feel itself as needing proof to justify any of its often very radical claims, radical in relation to the Torah from which it's deviating. And here is an example of one of the rare instances where it's not unheard of, but it's not at all common, where the Mishnah acknowledges the verse in the Torah that it's trying to deal with, right? The stubborn and rebellious son who is named by his parents as glutton and drunkard, okay, refers to that. And then it brings up not so much a proof text, and it says, this isn't actually a proof text, but there's some hinting in this text, again, this is rare, that, as you said, the glutton and drunkard named over there in Deuteronomy, where it describes who this stubborn rebellious son is specifically referring to someone who eats this meat and drinks this wine that we are somewhat ridiculously defining as evidentiary requirements and what constitutes being a drunkard and a glutton. Okay. I don't know what to make of it.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting about it to me, it's a little bit of a different point, but it's just that in the Torah, it's saying we have this son. It's not that he had some meat and drank some wine. He's a glutton and a drunkard, meaning that the problem with him is that he's a drunkard. The problem with him is that he's gluttonous. Whether that just means he eats a lot or he just has, it most likely means something more like he has appetites that are insatiable, and that this is much more definitional about him, where the Mishnah is taking it in a different direction and saying that it means that he had a meal in which he was gluttonous and drank a lot. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like taking the label liar.
Like
if you're a liar and saying if you lied once, you're that, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly what to make of it because part of it feels like, well, that's actually widening the category because it's saying not that you have to be deemed a liar, it's just that you told a lie once or a really bad lie or something like that. So on the one hand, it kind of feels like going in the opposite direction, but there's another way in which it feels like ultimately it's moving you in the direction of closing it down, because it says this isn't actually definitional about somebody's overall behavior. It really is looking to a moment in time. And that moment in time, all these different things have to happen. And it's so unlikely and impossible for that to be that it's really quite clearly telling us, like, this is not a thing anymore. This is, so I don't know if that's totally intentional, but it feels like it connects.
You know what you're reminding me of? You're reminding me of the way that Leviticus, specifically Leviticus 18:22, and elsewhere, 19:21, have been read in our in modern times, when the category of homosexuality has become an identity, where homosexual, quote unquote, has become an identity, not a behavior. It's been understood to represent anyone in this identity category.
Mm.
And more recently, those who don't take my approach, but who take a different approach, say, no, it refers to a behavior. And actually, it implicates a much narrower band of people. It's not talking about people in this identity category. It's talking about, two men who engage in anal intercourse. That's what it's talking about. Or even more, men with a specific relationship to one another, a power differential. And that feels like the kind of move that you're suggesting the rabbis may be making here, from a kind of vague, very easily abused labeling, fuzzy labeling thing, to know what are the behaviors. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's gonna. I think what we're about to read next is very much. It only works if it's about a particular incident rather than an identity. And so, it may be that, it's. I think the thing to point out here is that the language of the Torah clearly seems to be implying a person with a character defect, right? A person who is, as an identity, a glutton and a drunkard. And the Mishnah is moving that to a person who did something at a time. And they're then going to take that thing that the person did at that time and narrow the circumstances so much about when that time can be that it sort of legislates it out of existence. And what that means functionally is that there were probably a lot of people that the Torah would have defined as a ben sarer u'moreh, like, people that are gluttonous and drunk a lot. What we know what that person looks like, and all those people are not that they're necessarily going to get away scot-free, because there still might be a time when they had a big meal and had a big amount of wine, but somehow that the fact that you see somebody walking around who looks like, quote, a glutton, no longer is going to be necessarily a shameful mark on them.
Yep.
I think it's interesting how it connects to what you're talking about in terms of like other identity categories, like homosexuality, and whether there's actually something going on here as well that has a tendency to remove identity as something that one should that should mark somebody, that you should ever make any judgment on somebody based on their identity. No, only based on a particular action at a particular time.
Yeah, I like this. I like this direction we're going in. I think you may be right. I think it may be getting at the dangers of the abuse of labels and identity categories, and the the tendency to impute certain values and assume certain behaviors from people who we label in this category, that category.
Well, and I wonder, since we've been talking about this, right, the big idea of what we're doing is to say, well, if we can see what the rabbis were doing to the Torah, then we can potentially do that to the rabbis in the next era. Then I think the question gets raised: what are the categories that Judaism over the last 2,000 years may have constructed or approved of that we now would not approve of? Just like the Torah established the category of the wayward and rebellious son, or perhaps the category of the glutton and the drunkard, which the rabbis, for various reasons, say that we don't want to have those categories anymore. So instead of looking at somebody as a categorical problem, we're going to look at somebody as look at their behavior. what might those categories be in the next year? And homosexual might be one of them, but are there others that are even less,
You know what this is also bringing up for me? It's bringing up for me the shift that I see happening in the world of social justice, particularly in looking at racism, and Ibram Kendi saying, and other Black scholars saying, no, it's not about the identity racist. It's about saying racist things and doing racist things.
mm-hmm.
And it's not helpful nor true to identify people as racist or not racist. First of all, we've all been raised in a racist society, so we all are racist, right? In a certain way. Black people, white people, indigenous people, all people. And he says it's much more right to acknowledge or point to racist acts, racist utterances, and not right. So that feels like the same kind of move away from an identity to behaviors.
Well, it's also it's interesting because it raises, like, you could imagine a situation where some previous document that we were looking at said, racists should be treated in this particular way, right? In this and by the way, I think we say that a lot about the implication a lot. People say this about the North, that the implication when we talk about racists, a lot of times the implication is we're talking about white Southerners, and that's allowing the Northern people who sort of don't imagine themselves to be racist, aren't out there saying bad words and actively trying to be mean. They say, well, I'm not a racist, because I know what a racist is, and that's not me. And one possibility is to say, no, actually, you are a racist too, and let's expand the category of racist. And another approach may be to say, okay, whatever, let's not debate about that. Let's debate about what you should do and shouldn't do. And, Mr. Northern white person, you're doing a lot of things that you shouldn't be doing. So let's focus on that and not worry as much about the label.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. And then I would say, within Judaism too, what are again, some racist for sure is also a problem within Judaism, but are there other categories of where we label people Jewishly?
I think the category Jewish might be that same. We might be moving in this, or should move in the same direction. Should we really? I don't know. I'm talking as I'm thinking, and I can feel myself going to the edge here. But should we have like Jews and not Jews, or should we have people who do Jewish things, or sort of have Jewish values, and people who don't? Right. And I'm also standing on your shoulders as someone who has really opened up possibilities for what it might look like in the future to be part of, what we now call Jewish.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of tangentially related, but we've been talking on Judaism Unbound over the last few weeks about Jewish philanthropy and asking, like, well, what is Jewish philanthropy? What do we mean by that? Does that mean that the person receiving the money is Jewish? Does that mean that the person giving the money is Jewish? Or does that mean that it might be both or neither, but the process of deciding how to give the money was Jewish, right? Or is it something else? And, all of that, I think that previously, when somebody said Jewish philanthropy, they probably meant that it was somebody who is Jewish giving to somebody else who is Jewish, not necessarily through a process that is inherently Jewish. Whereas it may be that that's not the right way to look at it at all, or certainly not the way that we want to look at it going into the future.
I'm kind of excited. Excited about my idea here. Our idea here that what Jewish means is not actually going to mean necessarily either you were born of a Jewish mother or converted, but that you choose these Jewish behaviors. I don't know. How many Jewish behaviors do you have to choose to be Jewish? Or maybe we're going to let go of the identity category of Jewish altogether. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and we talked about this early on when we talked about actually that same text about the impeachment and removal of Rabban Gamliel, where the first thing that they bring up is who is a Jew. You know, it says they solved every problem that was on the table in the study hall that time, and but the
Right.
only example that they give is this example of who is a Jew, which is somebody who is specifically the kind of person who the Torah says can never be a Jew, and they decide that he can be a Jew.
Right.
And so I think that where that takes me is that I really think that if and when we imagine that we're actually in the switch over from one era of Judaism to the next, at least in the previous two, we've seen the definition of who can be a Jew change. And so in the Bible, it's a patrilineal descent and specific categories of people can never become a Jew. In the rabbinic era, it's matrilineal descent and those categories that the Bible said can't be a Jew actually can be a Jew, for all kinds of like legalistic reasons. But the bottom line is that it can. And the third era would suggest, I mean, not doesn't have to be, I guess, just because it was the previous two times, but it's certainly open to be that there's a new definition of who is a Jew. And I've advocated for non-lineal, it's solely based on choice, but it could be other things as well. And yeah, like maybe the category itself becomes problematic. Maybe saying non-lineal descent is, I've thought that was such a radical thing to say, but actually it's even more radical to say that the category itself should be put into question.
Yeah. All right, we could put a sticky on that, but
Right.
I'm kind of excited about that.
All right, well, we'll go back there. So let's go. So I think we want to jump back into the text now. Well, no, you want to. We didn't. We don't have this in our source sheet, but I think we want to talk a little bit about what the Gemara says about the Mishnah that we've been talking about. It's mostly not critical for moving our argument forward, but you want to share a little bit of that?
Sure. The Gemara does what Gemara often does. It will either, and we might remember that the Gemara will always do one of five things. It has one of five agendas always on any particular piece of Mishnah. It's going to ask who the author is. It's going to clarify the Mishnah. It might deal with any perceived conflict between this Mishnah and the Torah, or this Mishnah and another Mishnah. It's going to deal with scope. Well, what about this case? What about that case? How far does that apply? And it's going to ask for sources. Wait a minute. Where do you get that? And the Gemara on this Mishnah opens up with a question of clarification, the agenda of clarification. Wait a minute. How much is a tartemar of meat, that measure we talked about? And how much wine exactly? And then it's going to go on to deal with the scope. And it's going to further narrow the meat eating qualification to be not just meat generally, but actually raw meat. And that eliminates a whole bunch of meat eating episodes as implicating, right? Because it has to be eating, this boy has to eat raw meat, has to be salted. Well, how much of it is salt? So they're going to go, and then the wine, not just regular Italian wine, but undiluted Italian wine, and so on and so forth. So they're going to continue to narrow what meat is implicating and what wine is implicating. Okay. Then let's move to the next Mishnah. So we're, again, jumping back in history.
So, and by the way, now I'm blanking. I'm trying to remember where this was, but this is another one of these cases where you see the Mishnah already limiting the Torah, and then the Gemara limits the Mishnah even more.
That's right.
Then that's not always the case. Like you were saying, a lot of times the Mishnah doesn't even talk about the Torah, certainly not directly. So sometimes it's really just the Gemara, limiting the Mishnah. But here we're seeing both. We're seeing both steps.
Right. Maybe we should note that Mishnah as a category, and I would say, option 3, new master stories. But we see this in the Mishnah. That's where I'm getting this idea. It really has sort of 3 buckets of material. It's basically going to be doing 3 things to the received tradition, Torah, and whatever oral tradition added to that by the time we get to the Mishnah. It's either going to limit right? It's either doing restrictive legislation and limiting what the Torah has. It's either going to be expansive legislation, expanding on what the Torah said. Like, ooh, this is good. Let's make that a big deal. Kashrut, right? They love kashrut. Now they want to really blow it up. Stubborn and rebellious son, they're really going to limit. And then the third category is new stuff they're making up and throwing against the wall that either has some traction, has had some traction on the ground, and oral history was already developing over some number of years. Probably most is in this category. Maybe some is, let's just try this out. Let's try this new practice. Let's try this new thing called brachas. And here we have the Mishnah staying in this limiting category, something that they didn't like, that they want to squeeze down basically out of existence.
Okay, so let's go on and go to the Mishnah, which is now on page 71a of the Talmud, and it says, if he stole, so he is the wayward and rebellious son, if he stole that which belonged to his father and ate on his father's property, or he stole that which belonged to others and ate on the property of others, or he stole that which belonged to others and ate on his father's property, he does not become a stubborn and rebellious son.
Okay.
Unless, unless he steals that which belonged to his father and eats on the property of others. So if you imagine like a box of 4 where, it belongs to father, others, ate it on the property of father, others, right? And you get 4 possibilities. The only one that could possibly make him turn out to be a stubborn and rebellious son is if he steals the food from the father and eats and runs off and eats somewhere else.
Okay, well, one thing I was also thinking of that, like Gregor Mendel's 4.
Yeah, right.
I don't forget what those are called. What I forgot to say was the previous Gemara also limited I think it was the previous. Yes, it was the previous Gemara. Sin. They do a play on words, and they say the word glutton, zolel. No, drunkard, zolel, has within it the word zol. Or zul, zayin, vav lamed, and that also means inexpensive or cheap. They say, oh, he also has to buy this meat, on bargain closeout. He has to buy it at a cheap price. Okay, so this is when the chuckles get really big. Knowing that he has to himself have bought the meat and bought it at a cheap price, not its going price. This Mishnah is playing on or assuming he has to get that money from an illegitimate place as well. And he has to have stolen the money from his father. Not that he has to eat it in front of his father, but he has to steal the money. The thing he's stealing isn't the meat from his father. He's stealing the money to buy it cheaply from his father. Okay,
but that's only based on the fact that the Gemara had made that wordplay from the previous Mishnah, meaning if we were just looking at the Mishnah, you wouldn't necessarily see that part that it has to be stolen money. You would assume it's stolen food, right? Just based on the Mishnah itself.
I think you're right. And maybe the pshat, the simple understanding and the way the Mishnah was understood in its time might have been steal the meat from the father. I'm not sure. Maybe. Because you're right. It all it says is steal from his father. It doesn't say steal money to buy the meat. It just says steal. And you're right. You would presume it means steal the meat itself.
But anyway, but where we're at now is that not only does he have to be having this neutral meal, it's not a mitzvah, it's not a non-kosher, it's lunch, but he stole it from his father, and whether he stole the food or the money, if he stole the money, not only did he steal the money, but he bought really low quality meat and wine because it was cheap, and then he
No,
ran
no,
off.
no, 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 no.
Oh,
It's trickier than that. It's not low quality wine. I'm not sure
uh-huh.
about the meat. It's high quality wine, super high quality wine at a low price, which is
Oh,
going to be even more, even harder to find and less likely for him to be able to do, right? This is a
right.
bottle of, I don't even know the names
It's
of
like
fancy
when
wines.
Costco gets like a really special deal where they get like some clothes out of a high end, Louis Vuitton bag or something, and they sell it for cheap.
There
So
you go.
yeah.
Uh,
Um, so okay.
so what? So what are the four boxes possibility? Let's just say money, just to keep it simple. Either he steals money from his father, buys the meat and eats it in his father's house. Okay, or he steals money from other people and he buys the stuff and eats it in someone else's house, his buddy's house. Or he steals the money from his father, buys the stuff and eats it at his buddy's house. Or steals the money from his buddy's friend's, right, from his friend's father's dresser, buys the stuff and comes back to his own house and eats the stuff there. Okay, those are the four boxes.
Mhm.
Okay, fine.
And the only one that he is in trouble for is if he steals it from his father and goes and eats it over at his buddy's house.
Great,
Right.
great. Okay, so that's what the mission says. And then there's the additional opinion. We get an opinion, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda.
Right. So we haven't looked at that yet. So
Okay.
so then Rabbi Yosei, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says he does not become a stubborn rebellious son unless he steals that which belonged to his father and to his mother. So
Okay.
yeah. And
So
which, by the way, just to point out, I think that there's this might not sound so shocking or what surprising to us today because it's like whatever is mine is my wife's, etc. But in those days the understanding was that once she got married the mother didn't own anything, right? So there really wouldn't be such a thing as something owned by the father and the mother.
and that's one of the things precisely that the Gemara says. How is that even possible? How can the mother have anything halachically from which the child could steal?
Mm-hmm.
That's a challenge the Gemara brings to this very opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So clearly, I mean, just the fact that it's just so convoluted and funny. I mean, you say like you can almost feel the chuckle coming, like we're laughing, like it's just the whole thing is funny.
Right. And again, people shouldn't think the laughing is laughing at the rabbis.
Mm-hmm.
They're not silly, stupid, or foolish.
Right.
This is a laugh. We're laughing with them. We're laughing in acknowledgement of the sophisticated argumentation that they want to, what's the word? Telescope? Not telescope. They want to
Telegraph.
That's it. Telegraph. I knew it was a tell us something. They want to telegraph to us as deliberate, radical reads,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can know how to do that in the future on other issues when we need to.
Yeah, I mean, the only way that I would like just make a slight tweak to what you just said is that I've been saying this. It's like they never expected that we would be reading this. They were trying to telegraph to other rabbis that this is kind of so, and they were expecting that other rabbis would have the same reaction that we're having because we now have the basically the same education, better education than most rabbis had throughout history, general education. I mean, and enough Jewish knowledge to see that this is funny, and we're having a good laugh about it. They were having a good laugh about it back then, right? But it wasn't like such a good laugh that it was farce. Like, in other words, if this was like a Purim play, it wouldn't have made its way into the Talmud. They would. I'm sure that the rabbis back then had a lot of fun jokes that they would have with each other and have a good laugh about some crazy convoluted way of talking about some law. That wouldn't make it into the Talmud because they were like, that was just, Rabbi Joshua's funny joke that day. This is like, no, this was funny, but serious enough that they want to hold on to it as real. So what that means is that this is real, authentic, rabbinic Jewish legal reasoning that is funny, and they knew it. And meaning that, like, again, I take it and say, like, well, if there's something that we don't like we really don't like too, like, let's say that Leviticus, a man shall not lie down with a man, like, actually there's a certain way of, like, if you look at Steve Greenberg's book about this, Wrestling with God and Men, where he tries to take on the halachic conversation. It's been a long time since I read it. I don't remember this, but I don't think that he had a chapter in there that was kind of like trying to almost like make it so convoluted that it became funny. But I actually think he should have included that chapter because that would be authentic halachic reasoning to try to get rid of this awful line by kind of making all these kind of strange convolutions that would ultimately say, oh yeah, and so of course that only applies on Wednesdays in outside of Jerusalem and whatever, it's such that it wouldn't really have any effect.
Yeah, Steve is a friend of mine, and we have very different approaches, and I'm not sure he shares my belief that there's actually a wink here.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I want to point out again that this is funny only if you have a pietistic understanding of Torah. Only if you assume the Torah is the fixed, unchanging, immutable word of God, and that's what they believed and that's what we're supposed to believe. Only then is it funny. But I don't believe they thought that. And so for them, I don't think it was so much funny as, oh, that's a good one. Great. Right? And so it wasn't like surprising and outrageous. It was to them. And I don't think it should be surprising and outrageous to us. I think it should be, oh yeah, that's a good one.
But I do think that, I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I also think that there are cases where they're very serious, and even cases like the kind of cases where, they also said my hands are tied, right? What can I do here? Or there are cases like,
wait, I'm not sure I agree with that. Where do they say?
Did they never say that my hands are tied?
I can't think of an example.
Okay. But then there's a case like we looked at a couple of weeks ago, those divorce cases where they weren't really funny, right? In other words, Rava found a way to kind of legislate that out of existence, but not necessarily in a funny way, or in an overly convoluted way, but actually in a very straightforward way, right? That just said, well, this doesn't make sense. And you could say here, like, you could have done this in a different way. You could have said, we shouldn't kill a pious, wayward and rebellious son because there are some sons that are just funny and we would accidentally think that they were wayward, and there's some sons that are wayward but we wouldn't, some analogous reasoning. And you would say, what, and you're gonna like get rid of something from the Torah just because to protect somebody who's a comedian, and they would say yes. So you could imagine, but for some reason they choose to go a different route here, which is this kind of convoluted limitation funny route. So
I think my guess is that the rabbis know that the people to whom they have to sell these innovations and deviations from Torah do have a more pietistic understanding, or they're instilling in folks a very simplistic view of what Torah is to compel compliance. And they need to empower the salespeople with the techniques to justify the changes. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. Again, I sort of raised this question of like, who would have been expected to hear the justification? Because it may be that people would, because if you read something like, there is a difference between the divorce cases and this, which is that in the divorce cases, it doesn't specifically say in the Torah, you can't get divorced, you can't do this, you can't do that if there's a conditional divorce. They're using a principle that they're deriving from the Torah, ones, right? And the argument against it would be kind of too detailed for most people to come up with. So whereas here is something that you read every year in the Torah portion where it says if you have a stubborn and it's very direct, right? So you would expect that your average Joe, your average Yosef, would have heard of this stubborn and rebellious son. In fact, would hear about it every year. And if he had a son like this, he might come to the rabbi and say, I've got a stubborn and rebellious son. I think I have to kill him. I read that in the Torah last week. And it may be that actually,
I think you have to kill him.
You have to kill it, right? And it may be that part of what's going on here is there is an expectation that these arguments are going to be made to regular Jews, and those regular Jews are not particularly knowledgeable, but they may be pietistic. And so they might not actually laugh the way we are because we know more than them and we're more sophisticated. And actually what the Talmud is trying to give the rabbis here is a lot of arguments, because you're probably going to get a lot of pushback from the regular person who keeps saying, but I read about it in the Torah. It was in last week's Torah portion. You say, yeah, but it's this and it's that. And there's so many excuses that eventually they're like, okay, I mean, I guess so. Yeah, I guess.
I think so. I can see that. And I think that's how it works.
And so again, I think that raises this point that part of why it's hard for us to read some of this stuff today and understand exactly what was in the mind of those who wrote it is that they didn't expect, like, we think of ourselves as regular Jews. I mean, you're a rabbi, but but like we think of ourselves as like regular people, and regular people were never expected to be reading this. And so I think the only way to kind of fully get into the experience of this is to pretend, at least while we're sitting here, that we are rabbis, right? And that we are the people who are expected to hear this, but that there weren't very many of us. And so if we get this and we say, hey, this is actually kind of funny, this is so convoluted that it's just sort of obviously some effort to circumvent, then we, just by knowing that, just by having that experience of the text, we are revealing that we're actually quite sophisticated. And the only people who are that sophisticated back then were probably rabbis, and that there's someone else who this text is sort of for, who wouldn't necessarily see that it's so sophisticated. That's kind of who it's aimed. That's who the bottom line is aimed at.
I think that's right. And I see our time running out, so I won't go into this story now. But when we pick up next time, remind me to tell you the story of the conservative movement's decision at a certain point to share the tshuvot, the legal opinions on new decisions, with the conservative laity, and what they were willing not to share. So. We'll talk about that next time, because I think it relates to this.
Yeah, I not even knowing the story, I suspect that it does. So yeah. So okay, we'll leave that on a cliffhanger, and we'll pick that up next week.
Okay, great.
Seeing you then. And by the way, I guess next week, this time next week, we should have a new president.
God willing. God willing.
All right. See you next week.
Bye, Dan.
Bye.